Okay, so this is the first game in a tournament I played on Saturday. I took a break over the weekend just to relax and not make videos, but here's the tournament I played, and this is the first game. I was playing with the white pieces versus my opponent, Tanvi Borse, I believe, and yeah, the time control was 45 minutes with a delay of 5 seconds. So we'll get into it. So I start off the game with d4, the move I like the most, and my opponent plays knight f6. I play the Jampowski. My opponent plays this line with d5, which I already love playing against because d5, to me, already feels like a bad move because I love these ideas in Jampowski where you're able to take the knight and get into a position where your opponent has doubled pawns here, and I'm able to quickly play e3, c4, knight c3, knight f6, and develop the bishop and quickly get a better position. So, of course, that's what I do. My opponent takes the g-pawn, which is the best way to play because she's going for something along the lines of e5 in the future. And I immediately play the move e3 with the idea of playing c4 and that stuff that I was talking about. I'm not scared of e5. If my opponent plays e5, I will play knight f3. And in this position, I'm doing pretty well because, yeah, my opponent has a big center, but I'm going to start chipping that away with c4. And I'm never scared of e4 here. e4, knight d2 just actually helps me prepare c4 even more. So e4 would be a big mistake. So I'm not scared of e5 at all. My opponent doesn't do that. My opponent plays this weird move. She spends, I believe, like 5 minutes here because I assume that she's never seen this position, and she plays the move a6, which is a little bit strange to me. Obviously, it doesn't really do anything. She's preventing like bishop e5 in the future, but there's no point to it. So I quickly play c4, and here my opponent goes on a long think. My opponent thinks for a very, very, very long time. I believe she spent like 10 minutes here, and we already know, of course, she's not very happy with the position. It's move 5, and I don't think she's ever seen this opening before, and I think already I must have an advantage here because my opponent wasted a move with a6, and now she plays the move knight c6, which is, again, probably a bad move because a lot of the time you're not really supposed to block your c-pawn. You'd love to, with black, you'd love to play c5 maybe, c6 maybe. There's lots of times where you don't want to block your c-pawn, so I'm thinking, okay, like my opponent has no idea what they're doing in the position. I must be better. And this is actually the second time I played Tanvi, so I kind of know what she likes. She likes playing the Sicilian and more e4 approaches. So I know that I'm probably doing quite well, and I'm taking her out of her comfort zone. So I play knight c3, very simple, and I keep a very healthy advantage. Takes, and I have attacks on the f7 pawn. I have attacks on maybe the b7 pawn. If I bring my queen out this way, I can simply develop and castle. But actually, I don't want to do that because my opponent has this open file all the way down to my king, so it's a little bit iffy. My opponent plays bishop f5, and I immediately think, that here, I spent a lot of time here. I immediately think, first thing I think is that queen b3 must be winning. Because, of course, I mean, it's a fork. I'm attacking both pawns. But then I realized my opponent has the move e6. And I can't really take this pawn. Because after some knight a5 stuff, I thought that I was probably, like, not doing quite well. I mean, I didn't really see where I'd put my queen. I thought I was just almost, I might be losing here, right? But apparently this isn't losing. I don't know why. Let me turn line. So I have, queen f3 actually manages to save it because after knight takes, I have this move, I have the move queen c6 check, which is just like no, I'm not gonna find that. I'm like 1500 over the board. I'm not gonna find queen c6 check. That's not like feasible for me. I'm not gonna have this idea. So of course I thought that this didn't work because of e6. So I didn't think it would work. So instead I go for the move I go for the move a3, which is, it's simple, right? It's simple. My opponent puts 9 on c6, so I will make sure that it can't get in to the squares on c2 and d3. It makes a lot of sense. It's a very simple prophylaxis move. I'm probably going to have to pause the recording here and come back in a second. Okay, so I do play a3. I try to stop my b4, and I think, okay, I keep advantage. I have the queen b3 idea later, and I'm doing quite well, right? So instead of doing anything, my opponent plays the move queen d7 here, which makes a lot of sense, right? It makes significant sense. It's obvious my opponent is going for long castles and is going to try and beat me on the king side, obviously. So here I think, okay, well, queen b3 didn't work a move ago, but now queen b3 does seem to work because it is a fork. Because now, okay, if e6, I'm able to take on b7 with an attack on the rook, and I'm doing much better because after rook here, I can take this pawn and I will win the game. But now, so I assume my opponent's only move was to castle the king. If I played queen b3 and then I would take this pawn, I'd be up a pawn, I'd win the game, right? Very simple, very simple. So I played queen b3, which doesn't work. It's actually incredible. It's not for any move that like you'd think. It doesn't work for the move that I saw. It doesn't work for long castles, which is incredible. Just hanging the pawn on f7. So of course I oblige. I take the pawn. I think, oh wow, I'm up a pawn. I'm up a pawn against my stronger opponent, and I'm probably going to win this game. And I thought, okay, my opponent's probably going to play the move e5 because e5 seems to do a lot. It attacks my center and attacks my bishop, and I'm okay. I'll find a way out of this. I'll play like bishop h5, and I'm going to be comfortably better up a pawn. And my opponent shocks me. My opponent plays e6. And this is wrong. This is wrong. I know this is wrong. The reason why this is wrong is very simple, because my opponent's idea was to play e5, right? That's the whole point of my opponent's plan. And then I struggle in the center. But with e6, I have another tempo. I can like stop trying to be super quick, and I can just move my bishop out. And now my bishop is free. I'm simply up a pawn. And my opponent actually realizes their mistake. My opponent realizes her mistake. She plays e5 now. What she should have done, she should have played e5 a move ago, because now when e5 happens, I have the move d5, and I'm comfortably better up a pawn, and I'm gonna win this game. My opponent, of course, plays the move knight a5, attacking my queen, trying to go to c4 in some lines. I go queen d1. Just, you know, dropping the queen back. It seemed like the most active square for it. And my opponent goes to c4 with the knight, which I thought was wrong, actually. I thought this was not correct, because then I would have like something like e4, and my opponent's not actually threatening to take on b2, because I would be able to bring the bishop back in time, and then the knight would be trapped if it comes to b2. And I thought, okay, I'm still winning. I'm up a pawn. She can't take that pawn on b2, and I thought this was wrong. So I of course go with my plan. I play e4, which is the best move. My opponent goes back to g6, and I go bishop e2. And now I'm actually slightly worse, which surprises me. I couldn't tell you why. Well, actually I could. The reason why is probably because of the king side weaknesses, where my opponent will probably bring the rooks to the king side and start pounding me on these two squares. And my king is actually very weak here. So even though I'm a pawn, my opponent has incredible compensation for it. Of course, my opponent goes back to d6, which is the best square. I'm trying to play f5 at some point and attacking my pawn at e4. So I defend my pawn, and my opponent goes for f5. And I think, okay, I have a couple of options here. I want to defend this pawn, right? Because otherwise, if I don't defend it, I would lose. So I have a couple ways to defend it. I have queen c2, queen e2, and f3. Of course, queen b1 would be ridiculous. And I didn't want to take, obviously, because then I would be weakening my pawn on d5 too much, and I would probably lose it in the future. So I went for f3 here. This move I played, but queen c2 I thought was kind of ridiculous. I thought this was bad because of course my my queen isn't really in the party. My queen isn't really doing anything on c2. She's defending this pawn, but I thought this was kind of ridiculous. If I wanted to move my queen, I'd put on e2 instead, but I thought this was also wrong because I thought queen e2 was also wrong because, yeah, the queen does more here. The queen pressures the a6 pawn, and I might be able to sacrifice there in some lines, but I didn't think this was correct. So I eventually ended up playing the move f3, which is another mistake. Like, the reason the reason why this is a mistake is because I'm opening the f file for my opponent after takes. The move I should have played here was actually ef, which I wouldn't have played this because I thought, okay, my advantage would be gone here. I still thought I was winning. I still thought I was winning at this point, and my advantage would be gone after ef because the weakness of d5 is incredible. My opponent's going to recapture. I'm probably going to take with the bishop, and then I don't have any attack. I'm probably just going to lose the game. And I thought, okay, that'd be miserable. So I played f3, and my opponent goes bishop h6. Sorry, I thought they went takes, and I was just going to play. My opponent goes bishop h6, which I thought was a great move. Bishop h6. The whole idea of bishop h6 is like, well, it has two ideas. Of course, it develops the bishop. The secondary idea, the idea that I missed to understand previously, where I first thought this was wrong, was bishop h6 actually stops me from playing rook c1 in the future. And then without rook c1, I don't have an attack. Because if I had rook c1, then I would play queen e2, I'd be able to sacrifice, and I'd be able to bring my rook into the party through c1 and rook lifted up. But without rook c1, I don't have anything. I don't have any attack. I'm probably lost, and that's why bishop h6 is just a great move. I'm not sure my opponent saw that, of course, but that's why bishop h6 is awesome. So I go queen e2. I keep going with my attack because I don't have anything else, and I didn't think my opponent had a threat here. I still think I'm better. Because I thought I'd be able to defend, and my opponent goes rook df8, which is another move that starts putting up the gas, like starts putting up the pressure on me. I can win a pawn here. Actually, I can go takes. Actually, that doesn't win a pawn. My bad. No, that doesn't win a pawn at all. But I didn't even look at that in the game. But whatever. He goes rook df8, and I realize I don't have a move. But then I realize he isn't really threatening it. She isn't really threatening anything either. So I just play b4. I just like, okay, if you want to attack me, I'm gonna attack you. We'll see who wins. Engine kind of takes away the mystery. It says I lose, but I still think I'm better. And my opponent takes and goes queen f7, which is reasonable. She's bringing her queen to the party. I'm probably not winning this game, and it's actually a really rough position to play for white. And I'm worried. I'm definitely worried here. But I thought, okay, I play knight f3, and my opponent has nothing. There's nothing here. I'm able to play rook f1. Of course, I'm not going to castle over here because rook g8 would be ridiculous. So I'm not going to castle. I'm going to play rook f1. I'm going to start pounding it down that file, and I'm probably going to win. Knight f3, my opponent goes queen f4, and equality is restored. But that actually doesn't really mean much because I'm up a pawn, right? If equality was restored, if there is no compensation for either side, it should be +1. But instead, it's equal and slightly better for black. So that means black has an incredible amount of compensation for the pawn, and I really have to be careful. So I go rook f1, which is like one of the two best moves. I'm just stopping any ideas. And my opponent goes bishop h5. So I didn't really see what this threatened, so I just played a4, keeping up the pressure, and my opponent takes. Taking is wrong here. The actual move that my opponent is supposed to play is just to put up more pressure with rook hg8. And I don't really know what I do here. I'd probably lose. I'd probably lose if my opponent found that, but luckily she didn't. And she plays takes. I take with the pawn, of course, because I don't want to lose my h-pawn. And my opponent gives me this check, and I'm like, okay, well, she's not going to trade queens with me, so I play queen f2, I'm like, okay, I should be decently better. If I'm not better, then at least I'm able to defend myself and I'm able to make a draw. Because I thought, okay, there's two ways that I'm going for. I'm going for a win or I'm going for a draw. There's no way I lose this game. And so I go queen f2, and my opponent shocks me by trading queens, and I didn't understand this move at all, because okay, I'm trading queens, I should be better here because I'm up a pawn, I'm up material. So I end up deciding to take with a king. The reason I take with a king is because my opponent is trying to infiltrate with the bishop. That's the point of queen f2. If I take with the rook, I thought that I was not doing it correctly because my opponent gets this. My opponent gets to camp out on d4 for the rest of the game, and I didn't really like that. So I take with the king, and my opponent goes d2, knight a2, and bishop f4, targeting my pawn on h2, and I simply defend it. And I thought, okay, I'm under a little bit of pressure here, but I'm still playing for two results. I'm playing for a win or I'm playing for a draw. So my opponent goes rook hg8, and here is, oh wait, no, I have rook ad1. I'm stopping the bishop from coming in, stopping all this. And here, unfortunately, me and my opponent both got under 5 minutes on the clock, so we stopped notating. Yeah, I'm not very good at blitz, but this is kind of what happened. So I put a couple moves in here to give you like the general idea of what happened, but these might not be the moves that actually happened in the game. I'm not sure. Either way, this is kind of the gist of how the rest of the game ended, and I'm going to, yeah, I'll show you a little bit of this. So rook g6 was a move that my opponent played. Might have been the idea. The idea is, of course, to go to h6 and attack my pawn. I played something like h4. My opponent goes to h6, and I remember this. I have this idea of bishop f1 here, which is wrong. Apparently, knight c1, getting my knight back in the game, is better. But bishop f1, I thought was a pretty good idea. I would be doing quite well. The reason is my opponent can't play bishop g5 because, of course, then I have bishop h3 check, and I can take the bishop for free. And I thought that was pretty smart. My opponent goes rook fg8, and I go bishop h3 check, and I decide to blockade him on g4, which actually loses due to knight e4, but I don't think that's what happened in the game. I remember one more move happened. My opponent goes like here or something, and I play, and I'm like, okay, my opponent is trying to attack me. My opponent's trying to get some discovered attack, some like attack on my king with the pin on the pawn. So my opponent's attacking here, so I'm just gonna move my king very nonchalantly, and I lose to this tactic where I just lose a pawn. I'm not losing here, but eventually in the blitz, I do end up losing the game, which is really, really unfortunate. So that was this game. I wish I had more, but the rest of the game is pretty much cleanup. I didn't do very well, and I just lost all my pawns and lost the game. So yeah, let's get into the next game so we can have actually a full game instead of just a half game like this. Okay, so this is the next game. So let's get into it. So my opponent, of course, is slightly higher rated, around 200 points, I believe, in this game. So my opponent goes e4, and I go for c6, the Karo Khan, d5, d4, d5, and knight c3, an invitation to enter the Tartakower variation after takes, knight f6, takes, and here we are. So there's a lot of lines in here. Most of the time, my opponents will play something like c3, bishop d3, queen c2, and start pressuring on the king side, while I develop my bishops quickly, castle, and we might get into some opposite side castling situation, or he can always castle on the king side if he wants to. So he goes for this plan. I go bishop d6, the main move. My opponent goes bishop b3, castles, queen c2, and I go for an interesting move, which is the move h6. Now, of course, I can play g6, but I decided to go for h6 in this line just because I kind of enjoy it more. There's also lines where you can get into the into a pawn cube type scenario with like instead going for something like actually I kind of forget the lines, but now I've gotten a pawn cube in these positions a lot. Either way, this is what happens in the game: h6, and my opponent goes for knight e2, which is one of the moves. Instead of knight f3, which could allow bishop g4 in some lines. So I of course go with the main move, which is rook e8, developing my rook with tempo, because if my opponent castles, he's going to be in some issue, after which the knight will be stuck on that square. So my opponent instead goes for bishop e3, developing a piece and defending their knight, and I go queen c7, which doesn't actually attack the h2 pawn. Well, it would attack it if my opponent castles this way, so I'm not allowing that. But if my opponent doesn't castle that way, if my opponent plays like, I don't know, anything, this move, I wouldn't be able to capture this, because of this move my bishop would be trapped in their position. So that was never really my threat. My threat was that after my opponent goes for the move long castles, which is what he plays in the game, which is a very interesting move, he wants to get into some opposite side castling situation, I go for the move c5. And this was my whole idea. The reason why I wanted my pieces to get out. My bishop doesn't really have a good square. My bishop can go to g4, but it doesn't really do anything there. It's kind of more or less a target for my opponent's pieces. And my knight wants to go to the c6 square, so that's the point of c5, trying to open everything up. And if my opponent takes, I'll take back with the bishop and be happy. So my opponent goes h4, which is interesting. He's starting an attack on the king side, and I go for c4, which is the best move. And my opponent really has only one move. My opponent has to go bishop h7 here. If my opponent doesn't, then I don't really understand. What I would do, I'd go bishop h7, king h8 here, maybe, and try to trade off my light squared bishop. But that's actually not the right way. Either way, my opponent doesn't do that. My opponent goes bishop e4 immediately, which I thought was a mistake, because I didn't think the bishop was very good on that square. Yeah. Either way. So I immediately go for just simply development with move knight c6. My opponent goes rook dg1, obviously trying to play the move g4 and start an attack on the king side. And I thought, okay, well, I thought the position was kind of equal here. The computer obviously doesn't think so, with minus 0.9 being on the analysis. I decided to try and stop his attack with the simple move h5, which I thought was very reasonable. The best move is actually queen a5, and there's lines here where I'm able to sacrifice my rook for the bishop, which is kind of insane. Like after a3, I have rook takes e4, and after rook takes here, I'm basically just getting it on the light squares, and I'm winning the game. I didn't see this during the game, but man, you win some, you lose some. It's not the end of the world. Yeah, I would never have played rook e4. There's other lines where that's possible, but yeah, I never really, that was never really my intention. I played the move h5, stopping g4 very, very simply, very calmly, a little bit of prophylaxis, and my opponent goes bishop f3, which in the game I thought was very, very smart. I thought this move must be very intelligent, because I didn't see it at first. I realized that my opponent couldn't go for any f3 business, and I was happy with that, because of course, let's see. If my opponent goes for f3, then I will immediately win with the move f5, and the bishop is pinned to the undefended bishop behind it, and I would win the game. So my opponent can't do that, and I thought there was like no way that he'd be able to play g4, but this actually is a way, and I thought, okay, I missed a move. I have some pressure still, but I need to be alert. I need to be sharp in this position, and I decided that I can go for bishop g4, which would stop g4. I can go for something like f5, which would also stop g4. But then I realized, yes, those are kind of active ways of defending, but they're also not the most active. I'd like to defend while also starting a counterattack, so I found the move queen a5 in this position, which gets an inaccuracy by the low-level engine, but it is actually the best move. And the idea is very simple. I'm defending my pawn. I'm covering this entire file, and I'm also attacking the pawn on a2. I thought this was very, very smart, but I didn't think that the advantage could be any. I thought I had an advantage, but I thought it was very slight. Didn't think the advantage could be any more than like minus 0.3, minus 0.4 at the very most. But apparently the advantage is very, very high. And my opponent immediately blunders the game by playing king b1 and losing to this pin. This is kind of sad because I kind of wanted to see what my opponent would do after this, but of course there's not much else to really say. We play on for a couple more moves, and it's a little bit complicated. My opponent takes, and king a1. And my idea, I have to start an idea here. Being up a queen is great, but I have to have plans. And so my plan was basically I would defend my pawn with something like g6, which I do play in the game, and then I could bring the knight to the center by something like this maybe. I need to trade off as many pieces as I can, and I need to win the game. So I kind of went over that plan. My opponent goes for d5, and that kind of helps me. I've been able to put my knight in the center in one move instead of two with the simple knight e5. My opponent goes knight d4, and I bring my queen back to d7, which is the best spot for it, defending all the infiltration spots for the knight, well, the one infiltration spot for the knight, and threatening a trade of knight for bishop. My opponent goes back with the bishop, and I come here, forcing a trade of minor pieces. Opponent goes g4, I take, and take. My opponent can take the knight and take here, but for some reason doesn't do that. He goes for probably the more principled option, which is actually takes, and goes with the move h5, which is an interesting idea. It makes a lot of sense. Basically, he's trying to attack as kind of like a Hail Mary, but it never works because I decided to just defend myself with something like queen f5, attacking the pawn, defending my king, takes, and rook h2 doesn't ever work because he's not able to actually double up. And I say about this with the move queen f4, and of course if he goes rook g h1, I'm able to capture the rook, and he can't recapture because of checkmate. My opponent actually does do that, and so I take the rook, and my opponent allows me to play checkmate, and that is the end of the game. So yeah, that's 2 games from the most recent tournament. The next 2 will be coming out tomorrow, probably, unless I get lazy. And yeah, hopefully you enjoyed, hopefully you found it instructive. Good evening and good night.